Hi, everybody. It has been a historic day here in Texas. Ken Paxton acquitted on every impeachment article brought against him, 16 originally, but then a vote to dismiss 4 other impeachment articles. So we've been having legal roundtables throughout the 10 days of this trial. But now that we know the outcome, the verdict, I thought it was important to hear from political science experts about what could happen politically speaking within the Texas GOP, especially given the amount of infighting that we have seen. So I want to introduce our esteemed guest to you. We have Jon Taylor, who is a professor at the University of Texas, San Antonio, Brandon Rottinghaus, who is a professor at the University of Houston of political science, and Brian W. Smith, also a political science professor here in Austin at St. Edward's University. So I just want to ask each of you, and Jon, I'll start with you, for your reaction to what happened today in the Texas Senate chamber. Oh, Jon, I think you have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Oh no.
There you go. No, you're good. You're good.
I'm good. Sorry about that. My bad. I was a little bit surprised. I wasn't surprised by the outcome. Let me be blunt. But I was surprised by the vote itself, as in there was not even one of the articles in which we got even close to maybe making Ken Paxton nervous. And so Republicans circled the wagons. They basically decided that there wasn't enough evidence for whatever reason. And here we are at this point. I got to say, though, maybe it was a case of, as Royce West said a little bit earlier, that he had heard that there were Republicans who were willing to convict, and then they backed away from it for whatever reason. Maybe because there's still a trial that's going to be taking place in Houston early next year, plus an FBI investigation. But I was a bit surprised by what was almost a consistent 16-14 vote against for acquittal.
Yeah, and Brandon, what is sort of your preliminary assessment? I know we're all still digesting this, but what is your preliminary assessment?
I wasn't really shocked. It's certainly the case that we see partisanship as a heck of a drug. It's hard to get people to vote against that. And so as a result, we saw basically the outcome that we saw. I will say that I think that the outcome was largely kind of baked into the cake. We had rules set up that made it really a tough standard to meet. The criminal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt was just a real challenge, I think, for the evidence. That was one thing. I think, too, a short trial and a really quick trial were also both problems for the prosecution to be able to put things together. So I'm not sure that this was really set up in a way that was going to give the managers a lot of wiggle room. They really had to nail every single article, and with no smoking gun, it was just a challenge for them to be able to pull it off.
And how about you, Brian?
Yeah, I'm going to agree with Brandon on that. Partisanship ruled the day, and Republicans who might have been leaning towards conviction backed off when the votes aren't there. It wasn't worth risking your political career only to come up on the short end of the stick. Also, I think, like Brandon had said, about the rules. When you have that many articles of impeachment on the table in a limited time to try to get them, you're going to have to. You just don't have enough time to really make a full case, as opposed to there being 2 or 3 articles, and they ran out of time. The big witnesses that we wanted to see weren't there. So at the end, prosecution, harder time, wasn't able to do it.
Brandon, what does this mean for Ken Paxton, a huge political figure in the state of Texas?
I think for Ken Paxton and everybody who's kind of in Ken Paxton's camp, it certainly means revenge is afoot. Best served cold, as they say. So I think we're definitely going to see this emerge. It wasn't, but minutes until we saw Jonathan Stickland of Defend Texas to come out and say that this was going to be something they were going to run ads on. So we're going to see an endless stream of, digital materials. We're going to see, mail in mailboxes. This is going to be a primary motivating factor. And if you merge this with the likely to come school choice special session, it's going to be a powerful 1-2 punch. So this is not an issue that's going to go away. This is something certainly that we're going to see have long tendrils going forward.
John, what is your assessment about what this could mean for Ken Paxton himself? I mean, does he not only with regard to sort of political retribution, but does he double down on sort of these hard right positions that he has already had, but has vowed to keep up?
Well, obviously he's playing to his own audience if he does that. I would caution the Attorney General to slow his roll when it comes to getting all fired up, just because of the litigation he's facing ahead. That said, Brandon, I think, put it well in terms of just the kind of fight that's coming among Republicans, and then Paxton is going to be leading the charge, I think, as much as maybe Dan Patrick is. To me, it's going to be fascinating to see just a month from now or less, when we see the special session on school vouchers and teachers' pay raises, if we're going to have such animosity between the House and Senate that nothing gets accomplished and we end up with nothing happening for that special session. I think we might be beginning to see the beginnings, perhaps, at least the outlines of a potential Republican civil war coming, based on what we're seeing, particularly from the right. Maybe.
Yeah. I was actually going to ask you about that too, Brian. I mean, certainly there's this sort of warring faction between the Senate and the House, but the Republican infighting has really intensified over this case, over this Paxton matter.
I think there is a lot of infighting, but at the end of the day, all the candidates have that R next to their name. And I think for a lot of things, they're going to be a lot more conciliatory than we might give them credit for right now. Also, the governor has his opportunity that if the legislature doesn't pass what he wants, like they did earlier this summer, he'll call them back in. So we look, and yes, there's going to be some revenge, and we'll see that in the primaries in the upcoming elections. But I think the Republicans also realize it's better that we stay the majority party than turn it over to the Democrats, and especially over this issue.
Brandon, with regard to some of those Republicans, I mean, how do you think the Republican senators who were weighing the facts presented at trial versus the political landscape on the ground, how do you think they navigated that in their own minds?
Yeah, it's tough. And really, there were two consistent votes against Ken Patrick, Senator Nichols and Senator Hancock. They both had their own reasons for doing this, and I'm sure that they were careful with the evidence as we expect them to be and as their oath required them to be. But obviously, they have to make this calculation in the big picture, and that meant that they had to look at the evidence in a particular direction. I think it's easy to hide behind the kind of standard that the House managers agreed to in the Senate rules, where this was a pretty significant criminal standard. The obvious problem here is that it's something you can hide behind. And I think for many of the members, even though they think that Ken Paxton did something wrong, there's definitely a lot of evidence to suggest that he didn't handle his business right inside the office and that maybe he went too far on some things, but he didn't do it in a way that rose that standard. And they didn't link that in their mind to removing him from office. So even though he did something wrong, they didn't think it was something that was so bad that he ought to be taken out of office. And I think that's where a lot of the senators are probably going to kind of hang their justification.
Yeah, John, were you specifically intrigued by the votes by Senators Hancock and Robert Nichols?
Well, Hancock, I'm not surprised because I think he's retiring, if I recall. So, he basically had a free vote. Nichols doesn't stand for election until 2026. It's a long time between now and 26. People might forget between now and the primary in 26. I wasn't that surprised. I really thought there might be one or two others who might just jump on for at least some of these votes, and they just didn't do it. And that goes back to a question of, again, are they fearful of certain amounts of money that might be spent against them in a primary, being called rhinos, whatever it might be? I'm thinking in particular the power of people such as, Dunn and Wilkes, and their influence right now in the Republican Party of Texas.
Brian, and not in necessarily a striking way, but we also saw some Democrats vote no on a couple of the articles, particularly the article dealing with this open records decision and the release of alleged confidential information to Nate Paul. Were you surprised that some of the D's voted no on at least that article?
Well, we knew that, again, partisanship, this was a political trial, but it's also a legal trial. And as a matter of due process, you have to decide on what is presented at the case, the evidence presented in court, not what your party or the social media folks are saying. So you take that oath, and on those issues, the evidence really wasn't presented. And also on some of the issues that, when we think about the House managers and what they were going for, wasn't the real core of their case.
Brandon, can we extrapolate anything that this may say or mean for the Republican Party nationally? In other words, we know that this case has obviously had huge attention nationally, particularly among Republicans. But what is the takeaway on sort of the national stage?
Yeah, it's a good question, Tony. I think that for sure one of the things we're seeing is that it's the end of the Bush era. This is what Tony Busby promised in his opening and in his closing. They wanted to make us all about politics. I think they largely were successful at that. So clearly they've been able to win over some Republicans on that. But I think too, on the other sort of side of things, is that you're seeing this as a national story. And, Ken Paxton is on his way to Maine to talk to Tucker Carlson. Donald Trump tweeted about this. So we are talking about a, tremendously important issue for Republicans. And it wouldn't surprise me at all to see this become a kind of national rallying cry. And although Greg Abbott didn't exactly embrace it, he was a little muted in his defense. But it's certainly the case that we're going to see this propel some of these Republicans to a very prominent place nationally.
And John, what is the cry that Brandon, in your mind, what is sort of the national rallying cry that gets behind this?
Oh, you're seeing things such as, being there was a Democrat/Rhino conspiracy against Ken Paxton, that he's the best attorney general in Texas. He's fighting for our causes that are causes for Texas and the conservative movement and for the MAGA movement. And to be honest, Donald Trump wins a second term as president. Don't be surprised if Ken Paxton's his attorney general.
How about you, Brian? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think all eyes were on Texas because of who our attorney general is. When you think about the other 49 states, it's hard pressed to know who their senators or their governors are, but everybody knows Ken Paxton. And so it energized both parties, because here's your most visible attorney general from your largest Republican state on a national trial for stuff that is, when you just look at the case, it's downright salacious and fun. And so it got all that national attention. I think coming out of it, obviously Paxton's your big winner. Donald Trump is your second winner. He never abandoned his guy. And now he knows at that Tucker Carlson interview, we're going to hear what Ken Paxton has up his sleeve for his next lawsuit against the Biden administration.
Just one more question. It's important to note that Ken Paxton is not as though he is all of a sudden out of the legal woods. There are the state security fraud charges that are still pending in Harris County. There are, obviously, we know, an ongoing federal investigation. And then last but not least, there are two complaints that the state bar is considering that could lead to some sort of action against him. Does that matter out there for his constituency? I mean, it may matter in an official way, but what about those GOP voters in Texas? Brendan, I'll go to you first.
It doesn't seem to really matter. I think that the standard for accountability is pretty low for your own partisans, whereas it's very high for your out partisans. So I don't think that these things really matter in the same way. But you're right. These are serious charges. You got federal felony charges or state felony charges against him. You've got potential to lose his law license. These are functionally life things and career things that could damage him going forward. Politically, though, I'm not sure it's going to matter. These are definitely, I think, things that have been swept under the rug in the last impeachment. So it's unclear if it's going to have a real effect on him and the rest of the party, even or not.
John, does it matter?
It doesn't. Not for conservatives, not for the MAGAs. Basically, it's a badge of honor for Ken Paxton to have this.
And Brian,
I'm going to jump on that. You don't need to be a lawyer to be attorney general in Texas. And so disbarred, so what? And throughout the trial, that whole idea is overturning the will of the voters. And like John and Brandon said, the voters, especially the conservative voters, really do like Ken Paxton. So it is the other things, though. That's all those other criminal things. So he's not walking per se. He's got another big set of trials coming. So he should be happy about this, but also have to realize his next defense is coming, and it's not going to be a partisan one.
Really appreciate your time and insight, the three of you. Brian Smith, a professor at St. Edward's University of Political Science, Brandon Rottinghaus, professor of political science at the University of Houston, and Jon Taylor, professor of political science at the University of Texas, San Antonio. We appreciate your time and your insight to help us understand this historic and monumental day in Texas political history and Texas history at large. Have a great afternoon.